In 1932, the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study began. The study blatantly violated patient rights and went against the responsibilities of doctors and researchers to protect patients.
The preventable deaths and malpractice of the Tuskegee syphilis study prompted Congress's fight for patient rights and medical ethics laws, ensuring medical trials are moral, consensual, transparent, and safe.
Picture this. You're a poor black farmer living in the deep, segregated South. You've recently been diagnosed with bad blood, which in your rural town can mean anything from anemia to fatigue to STDs. You have very little education and healthcare is non-existent for you. So, naturally, when scientists come to your town offering free treatment under the guise of researching syphilis progression, you jump at the opportunity to be cured.
Unbeknownst to you, the study will not treat you and will instead lead to your preventable demise years later.
In 1932, 600 syphilitic black men living in Macon County, Alabama, were recruited to be part of the Tuskegee syphilis study. These men were uneducated, poor, and had extremely limited healthcare access. The scientists conducting the study did not inform the patients of the true intentions. Men were promised free treatment for their syphilis along with other government aid. Oblivious to them, the treatment they were getting was all placebo.
The study started off with bad but not egregious intentions. It was only meant to last 6 to 8 months in order to study the course of syphilis if left untreated. However, researchers kept extending the timeline while telling patients it was close to concluding. In 1936, 4 years after patients were promised a 6 to 8 month study, the time span was changed from under a year to until the patient's death.
Again, the patients were uninformed of this change and left in the dark.
The study would go on to last another 40 years, forever transforming the medical field along the way.
In the 1930s, rights and regulations around medical and scientific trials were almost non-existent. Clinical trials only gained popularity and recognition in the mid-19th century, a mere 80 years before the Tuskegee syphilis study began. Additionally, the only trials prior to the Tuskegee study were studying the effects of surgical procedures or new medicines. So, when the Tuskegee researchers proposed a study to monitor the natural progression of a disease, there was nothing to base the regulations of the study on.
The first clinical trial only consisted of testing varying diets in scurvy patients in the British Navy. The second notable trial used placebo medicine in place of an established cure to test the brain's interpretation of pain. While both this study and the Tuskegee syphilis study used placebo, one was used to study the neurological pain response, while the other was used to mislead and manipulate patients.
Due to the lack of trials by the time the Tuskegee study was proposed, there was no regulations or patient rights around the process, though this wouldn't stay the same for long.
In the 1930s, science was teeming with medical racism. Scientists and the public alike viewed people of color as inferior and subhuman. Due to these biases, medical professionals thought the diseases affected black and white individuals differently. In the case of syphilis, it was believed that the disease affected African Americans' cardiovascular system, whereas it would impact the neurological system of whites. This was especially prominent in southern states where segregation and racial prejudice were rampant. An official to the United States Public Health Service told the press, "The man's status did not warrant ethical debate. They were subjects, not patients. Clinical material, not sick people." Planned Parenthood supports this claim as well, stating, "They were research subjects much like rats, and because of their race, the men in the study were viewed and treated as less than human." Furthermore, the study was deemed a study in nature because most believed black people wouldn't accept treatment even if offered. Researchers backed this claim by citing the Tuskegee participants were not seeking outside aid, when in reality these men were under the assumption they were being treated while also being banned from local medical offices without their knowledge.
The idea of African Americans refusing medical treatment spread rapidly. As Alan Brandt wrote in his 1978 research paper, even the best educated black could not be convinced to seek treatment for syphilis. All of this culminated in the Tuskegee syphilis study conception and long-term continuation.
Less than a decade after the Tuskegee syphilis study started, America would join World War II. Nations such as Japan, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and Nazi Germany would all carry out their own forms of human experimentation. These nations targeted those who were mentally ill, disabled, impoverished, or part of other minority groups, something that the Tuskegee syphilis study also engaged in.
These experiments led to the creation of the Nuremberg Principles in 1946. This act specified what grounds a clinical trial can be run on. The Tuskegee syphilis study directly neglected what the Nuremberg Principles outlined, yet the researchers in Alabama made no effort to comply with them. Voluntary consent, a participant's permission without coercion, safety, protection from injury, disability, or death, and risk, the study being justified by the benefits, were all rules the Tuskegee researchers chose to disregard.
A common theme that's been seen throughout the entire study is dishonesty and manipulation.
From the beginning, researchers used deception to recruit the men in Macon County. The study paid local black pastors, priests, doctors, and trusted officials to recruit the syphilitic men, though the recruiters weren't informed of the true intent of the study. And so they lied to the men at the very beginning. And that's a basic, fundamental violation of their autonomy and dignity as persons. And from there, the whole thing just gets worse.
Researchers used the poor living conditions and limited rights of the men in Macon County against them. Men were poor, uneducated, illiterate, segregated, and had very little access to health care. Additionally, racism in the South made it very hard for men to secure any job besides agricultural practices. As a CDC official said, it's well known that all enrollees were black, that they were desperately poor sharecroppers and mostly illiterate is less than well appreciated. Researchers used incentives such as hot meals, burial insurance, healthcare, and many more basic necessities to persuade the men into compliance.
Years into the study, participants started to catch on when they realized their syphilis wasn't getting any better, yet they saw their peers being treated successfully with penicillin by local doctors. The researchers were quick to use manipulation by hiring one Eunice Rivers, a local nurse known for her beauty and kindness, to entice the men with hot meals and rides to and from their appointments. Officially, she was a scientific assistant, though the researchers had no interest in Eunice's medical expertise. Instead, her role was merely a guise designed to motivate the men into compliance with the study.
In the 17 and 1800s, funeral practices were revered among enslaved African Americans. Death was seen as freedom from the harsh conditions of their enslavement. However, many slave owners would not allow enslaved people to hold proper burials.
Even after the abolishment of slavery, burial ceremonies were still heavily valued by the African American community in the rural South. However, many families in Macon County could not afford a full funeral service. The researchers knew this and used it to coax the men by offering burial insurance for all participants as an incentive. Through the burial insurance, the Tuskegee Fund would cover the casket, burial plot, and clothing and makeup of the dead. However, without the knowledge or consent of the grieving families, researchers would also conduct an autopsy, which, if disclosed, would have been refused by many families due to religious and cultural practices. This deceptive practice allowed scientists to gather necessary data at the expense of transparency and honesty with the families involved.
In 1972, an insider in the study released information to the New York Times regarding the study. Officially, in July of 1972, the Tuskegee Syphilis study was featured on the front page. People, especially those of color, were furious. Many black and African American families looked to switch to non-white doctors to avoid clinical trials. One, Leandris Littard, said, "The tragedy of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment is deeply ingrained in the hearts and minds of particularly communities of color. And even so, 50 years later, there are frequent mentions of the Tuskegee study, particularly in terms of how some communities react to public health guidance."
When the Tuskegee syphilis study was exposed, it sparked an outcry for legislation regarding patient rights. Suddenly, Congress became very interested in revising the past bills and drafting new ones. One of the bills to come from this outcry was the Belmont Report. The Belmont Report outlines 3 ethical principles of clinical medicine: benefits, justice, and respect for persons.
Benefits is defined as responsibility in researchers to balance the risks and benefits of a test. Justice is ensuring all patients receive equal burdens and risks from the study.
However, respect for a person was the most prominent principle. It required a study to accommodate for participants' religious, cultural, and personal beliefs, as well as respecting someone's autonomy and right to choose. Disadvantaged groups were also protected from discrimination. This included groups with fewer rights, little education, low income, low literacy rates, or limited healthcare access. Patients were also required to give informed consent, meaning they know the true nature of a study, understand the risks fully, and consent without coercion.
The Belmont Report also gave participants rights that were not guaranteed before. For example, patients were given the right of knowledge. This ensures that patients are well informed about all aspects of the study, as well as any changes made throughout the course of the trials. The most prominent right established was the right to choose. This allowed participants to opt in or out of a study at any time for any reason.
Previously, medical and family records were public for all researchers. However, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, or HIPAA Act, ensured that patients' personal information was kept private unless the patient consented to their information being shared. Institutional review boards, or IRBs, were intended to ensure that ethical principles were followed. IRBs can change the rules to a study before and during its trials, as well as end a study abruptly if it does not comply with the ethical laws.
The tragic story of 600 victims enduring 40 years of lies, pain, unnecessary procedures, and manipulation will forever stand as a testament of the importance of patient rights and clinical responsibility.
Researchers in Macon County used medical racism to fuel the study's cruelties and prolong the trials. By disregarding patient rights and going against ethical responsibilities, legislation bloomed that would protect individuals involved in medical research.
The horrors of the Tuskegee syphilis study resulted in national legislation such as the Belmont Report, HIPAA laws, and IRBs being created, making the medical field safer for patients while holding doctors and medical researchers responsible for protecting patient rights.